Welcome in to David O'Gray. I have an exciting show for you today, especially if you're into genealogy. Our new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, I find his ancestry to be completely amazing and fascinating. I find him to be not only just a pope from America, but a pope because of his ancestry just really embodies just the complexities and sometimes the messiness of what it means to be from America, to be born here. If you are born here, then and you're not a Native American, then you're probably either your ancestors are either immigrants to this country, or they arrived here in this country on a ship destined to be slaves. Maybe you're a mix of both, like myself, free people and the descendants of slaves. And I find that Pope Leo in this way, sometimes our ancestry sometimes is messy as well. You think of the genealogy of Jesus. You have some some characters in there who, lives are a bit messy. Sinners. And when I heard the story break, and our guest today, Jari Honora, when the story broke, he's going to be on the show. He's a genealogist. He's certified. He's a professional. This is what he does. And it came out that he was not just an American, but from New Orleans, and his ancestors were Creole. I was like, wow, that's interesting. And then hearing that perhaps his mother and his grandfather and grandmother maybe were passing as white, and maybe changed their how they presented themselves once they arrived in Chicago. And that whole thing really is something that was really just fascinating me. Just the idea of passing. And Jar's going to talk more about that, and really the sacrifice and the messiness of that whole thing, leaving family behind, kind of forgetting about your past, just starting anew. It's something to me. It's in a sense, we were oftentimes also we're products of the people who raised us and the decisions they made, and the values that they had. So to have a pope who comes from this background, but being his ancestors immigrants on both sides, his mother's side and his father's side, and he's raised in that environment, and the values they passed on to him in their stories. And then hear also that from his brother that they're quite aware of their Creole background. And Jar's going to talk more about what a Creole is, but that they're aware of it, yet that they're never really, but they don't identify as Black. Again, that's just fascinating. So I wanted to bring Jari on to talk more about this, and because we never had a pope like this. First of all, we never had an American pope, and then we never had a pope with this type of background. So this is rich, and I hope you enjoy the show. And this is David L. Gray Show, and we'll be right back after the short introduction. Jari, welcome on, man. Glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you.
Yes, sir. So I want to really start at the beginning. That you're from New Orleans, and
That's right, born
when
and
you
bred.
heard, yeah, when you heard that this was the new Pope, Leo the 14th, and these Robert Francis Prevost, what are some things just went through your head immediately when you heard that name?
Um, I was intrigued by the fact that, surprised by the fact that he was an American, and intrigued by his last name, which I knew to be a French surname, but I didn't immediately assume New Orleans. A lot of people who live here in New Orleans did, but the name Prevost is not unique to New Orleans or to South Louisiana. It's a very common French surname, and I just wanted to know from whence his ancestors came. I didn't know if it was Canada or recent French immigrants to the U.S. And in actuality, the connection to New Orleans is not on his father's side. His father's side, as was confirmed today, I mean, I was leaning in that direction, but the team at Ancestry.com and others have confirmed that they are actually Sicilian on the father's side. And his grandfather assumed the name Prevost. So there's a bit of, there's a bit of a change in identity on that side, but of a different nature than on his mother's side, where they are from New Orleans. They were identified consistently as people of color, and that identity, of course, shifted once they migrated to Chicago.
Oh wow, yeah, that's fascinating. Now, I'm so proud of you as well. I think I mentioned this to you when you first came on, that your name is just everywhere online, right? And you've been in this field of genealogy for quite a while. And what did it feel like? Just to, you go online now, you do a Google search, you just see your name everywhere. What does that feel like?
It feels quite out of the ordinary. I am used to, doing research, being the person researching rather than a subject that people have taken an interest in, and all of these interviews and television spots. They're very nice, and I appreciate them, but they're keeping me from the archives, which is where I think I'm most at home.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to back up for a moment, just give some historical background here. Can you tell us what is at that point in time that we're talking about, what were Haitians doing in New Orleans, and what is a Creole?
Okay, well that's two questions. As far as what are Haitians doing in New Orleans, um, the very event that makes Haiti Haiti is the revolution that occurred in Saint Domingue. It was the French colony of Saint Domingue, and ultimately that overthrow of the colonial regime, the abolition of slavery, led to the creation of the first republic in the New World, first black republic in the world, Haiti. And so a lot of people who were fleeing the turmoil after that revolution ended up in New Orleans. A lot
Okay.
of them ended up in the other seaports along the Atlantic, so Charleston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, even Wilmington, Delaware. All of these places have uh, Catholic populations in particular that trace back to the Haitian Revolution. Mother Mary Lang in Baltimore is a product of that experience. And so, yes, certainly people here in New Orleans. The Holy Father's grandfather, it seems, was born in Port-au-Prince, not in that period in the early 19th century post-revolution, but actually in 1864. So this is during the
Okay.
American Civil War, and in the years leading up to the war and during the war, a lot of free people of color from Louisiana sought opportunities elsewhere, places like Mexico, Haiti, um, basically anywhere around the Caribbean, other than what Louisiana, which was part of the American South. Um, and so that sort of explains why his family may have been attempting to make a life in Haiti in the 1860s when he was born. As far as what's a Creole, that question
Right.
comes up all the time. And for me, being born and reared in a Louisiana Creole family, it's an easy question, but it's confusing to everyone else because they learn of the term through culinary labels and through movies and novels and all that
Okay.
sort of. Creole is a cultural designation. It's that simple.
Hmm.
It's the culture that's shared by those people who are rooted here in Louisiana, a culture that is born out of our colonial world, the amalgamation of French and Spanish and West African and indigenous peoples in the colonial society here. They create their own foodways, their own folklore. Of course, their religious practices are a part of and shaped by Catholicism, and the use of French, Spanish, or Creole languages. There are white Creoles. There are people who are entirely white who are, as we identify in this country as white, who are Creole. There are people who are black who are Creole. So in and of itself, it doesn't indicate anything about race. Now, there are Creoles of
Okay.
color, like my family, like the Holy Father's maternal family, like so many of our bishops, black bishops in this country, who are products of Louisiana. And so we are Creoles who do share that mixed, European and African ancestry. And in many cases, that admixture has led to some very unique phenotypes, including many that are, for all to all appearances, white, much like the Holy Father's family, which enabled them to get out of Dodge, to leave New Orleans around 1910, 1911, just before his mother was born, and go to Chicago and leave that identification as people of color.
Okay. So even though, and I think I understand from people who are quoting you online that they were designated as in some sort of census or birth certificates or marriage certificates, they were designated as black.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Into the 20th century, in the 1900 census, his grandparents and his aunts who had been born up to that date were listed as black. Some of his aunts whose birth certificates were recorded here in New Orleans in, say, 1906, 1908, what have you, are listed as colored, as the term was then. Um,
Okay.
but again, about 1910, 1911, they make that migration northward to Chicago. And in the 1910 census and there and forwards, the records all identify them as white. And this is a common phenomenon. I mean, for families of color in this country, I think most of us have a branch or two, or have an individual or two in our families that we sort of hear in family lore and whispers. Oh,
Yeah.
well, Uncle so and so passed for white. In many cases, these family members are never seen or heard from again. It's just a testament
Yeah.
to life at that time in America.
Yeah. So, and I asked that to connect what you were saying a moment ago about just the complexion of the skin.
Mhm.
So, would his ancestors have been rather light skinned?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
In throughout all of this, I'm reminded of a wonderful book uh, uh, entitled "Passing for White," and it's the story of the Healy family. I know you're familiar with Bishop Healy,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he had a brother who was president of Georgetown. He had another brother who was a diocesan priest, who was a parish priest. Several sisters who were women religious, and all of them in the mid 19th century, in order to carry out their vocations, they had to um, hide their true racial identity. So this is nothing new. It's nothing new even within the church.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what I was thinking about one of the Heelys. In fact, when I thought about the idea of passing in the church, and one of my books, I think I first encountered it. My grandmother who was from Selma, Alabama. She would also talk about people. Oh yeah, such and so is passing,
Mhm.
and um, but and there's another book I think I read. It's Our Kind of People. Our Kind of People was really a good book that talks about that as well, about that phenomenon. And so, um, but it seems, in one sense, you could say, "Wow, that seems kind of selfish, just to leave a lot of your family behind and move north, and just because people who are passing, sometimes their darker relatives just weren't invited to the cookout. They weren't invited to visit them in Chicago or Cleveland, wherever they moved to. So in one sense, man, same sounds kind of selfish, right, Jari? And then, but on the other hand, you have to see that's quite also the sacrifice for them. Talk about a little bit about why did some people find it necessary to, such as our Holy Father's family, why did they find it necessary to pass or move north and change their ethnic designation in society at that time? Why was that necessary? Why did they find it to be necessary?
Well, it was a result of um, the societal norms that rendered people of color, people who were identified as people of color, as second class, and the laws which reinforce that. We know that in terms of jobs, transportation, education, even admission into a lot of our diocesan seminaries, it was all of these things were closed to people of color until maybe the mid 20th century, sometimes even later. And Even seating in churches was on a segregated basis. And so families were under a lot of pressure. And those who were able to, some of those who were able to, they made that decision. And I'm sure it was not an easy decision to pass for white. Sometimes that decision came with a name change. Um, it came with an intentional sort of obfuscating of their history. Uh, in the Holy Father's family, in 1910, his grandfather is listed as Maltese. Uh, that Joseph Martinez from New Orleans, from Haiti, but born to New Orleans family, was not Maltese at all. But you find yourself in a position where you sort of have to explain why you're just a hue or of a different hue than your neighbors, a shade or two darker than they might be accustomed to, and so you create stories, you create narratives,
Mm,
and that's
yeah,
again a very common story.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And um, why is this? Why do you think this matters? With some people say, "Oh, David, why are you talking about this story? You seem to be focused on, race and things like that. And why can't we just why does it even matter? The Pope. Why can't we just worry about him being a holy Pope and pray for him and not worry about all this other stuff? And why do you think it? Why do you think this does matter in a sense? Because you're a professional, you're a genealogist. I mean, why do you think this matters historically?
I think that identity and relationships are important. When you opened, you mentioned that scriptural reading that puts most of the faithful to sleep, the genealogy of Jesus, when it shows up in our liturgical calendar of readings. But that was intentional. The fact that there is a genealogy contained within the Holy Scriptures, it places our Lord in the long view of Jewish Judeo Christian history, salvation history, and I think for each and every one of us, our family stories situates us in a particular context. There's a pastoral letter that came from the Vatican. I don't have the precise title in front of me, but it speaks to archives, which are usually a function of the chanceries of most dioceses.
Hmm.
And it says that archives are storehouses of culture for the new evangelization. And I think that's a very profound way of looking at it, that our cultural identities, the things that we find to be the, the practices that we find most engaging, the things that make us feel at home and welcome, are a way of transmitting the gospel and transmitting the faith from one generation to the next. And in
Yeah.
the Holy Father's family, they have a history of Catholicism that goes back um, to almost the very beginning of New Orleans and of Louisiana. So I'm happy that this is highlighting the importance of Catholicism here in my hometown, which some people may not know is the second oldest diocese in this country. We're second only to Baltimore.
Oh
And
wow.
so just today, I was looking at a baptismal record for I want to say a fourth great grandmother. So that's a great grandmother of the Holy Fathers, who was baptized down here in Louisiana in 1755. Um,
Wow.
so it also shows the longevity, the long history of the Black Catholic community, um, and which that's my common ancestry, again 200 plus years of Catholic Louisianians. So it brings this story home for all Americans, and it shows just how interwoven our stories really are.
Yeah.
People who were rooting for, whoever our new pope might have been, and thrilled that he's an American, now are embracing the fact that he is an American with an incredibly um, diverse ancestry. So I find this to be a godsend.
Yeah. And I noticed that some of your work, people are quoting that his grandparents were married there in the Catholic Church in New Orleans, and so do they, when they go north, do they carry their Catholic faith with them? Obviously they do, because their daughter, and there's obviously their grandson eventually. But do you know much about their Catholic faith in Chicago once they go there?
Very, yes, they were very, very devout Catholics. Um, the Holy Father's mother, uh, born in, I believe, December of 1911, the early part of 1912, she's baptized at Holy Name Cathedral in
Mm.
Chicago, and two of her sisters became religious sisters. So he
Wow.
is not the first vocation in his immediate family. And one of the things that he said in interviews long before he was Pope Leo XIV, when he was a cardinal and bishop and priest, was that he was open to a vocation in one sense because his home always had priests in it. They loved to come and eat his mother's food, and we know now. Well, now we know why, because she was a Louisiana cook. I'm sure they were looking for good food up there in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s. And what better place to eat than from a person who has solid Louisiana heritage?
Absolutely. Yeah, you can't beat that. I was surprised, not completely shocked, that the Holy Father's brother um, mentioned that they were aware of their background, the Creole background, and things like that. I don't know at what point in time they became aware of it, but did that catch you off surprise as well? Catch you by surprise as well, that their parents didn't really tell them where they come from and who they are?
Well, I have to correct you just a little bit. They were aware that they had some form of, roots, a link to New Orleans, but they were not
Okay.
aware of any connection to people of color. No, the brothers
Oh,
did not say that. No, they weren't aware of that. And you can imagine, as boys, as kids coming up in the 1950s and 60s, even if their parents, wanted to tell them, were interested in telling them anything like this, it just wasn't done. It simply wasn't done. They grew up in a world that was still very much bound uh, by laws of segregation, laws of discriminatory practices, and so in most families, the next generation and the generation that follows, and then Lord knows the generations that come after that, they have no clue. It's usually a process of rediscovery. So in the work that I do now, that so many
hmm,
young people are doing DNA testing, or they're given test kits as gifts to mom and dad and grandmother and grandfather, they're discovering, wow, we have in our admixture some sub-Saharan African background, or with the prevalence of genealogy websites, they're plugging in names and they're realizing, oh, we don't just have an immigrant past, or we don't just have a old sort of Yankee American past. They may have roots in the South, and roots that are mixed, and it's always a unpacking process that comes along with
yeah,
that.
yeah. Researching my own, well, really not research. We just kind of always aware on my on both sides of my family. We have track our histories very well. But I was always been kind of caught back by just the messiness of my maternal side of the family. Um,
Mm.
Bert Gray, I think of his name. We don't know if he's a slave or not. We know he's illiterate in the early 1900s, early 1800s. That he married Martha Gray, my great grandmother, Mama Gray. But she already had a son, and she said, I guess the arrangement was, okay, I marry you, but I'm not going to raise him, right?
Mm.
And so I think. this is Buster. He still makes it to Warren, Ohio, where my grandfather. They both make it to Warren, Ohio, near Cleveland, working in steel mills. And it was funny, Jari, when I'm in high school, I come home one day talking about, no, this is middle school. I like this girl, right? And my grandmother says, what's her name? I don't know if that's the thing, where you're from, but I guess maybe in small towns,
Oh
definitely,
yeah,
you always
that's
know
the first
the
question.
last name. Exactly. And so I tell her the name, and she's, oh boy, no, that's your cousin. And I'm still kind of excited. I was like, oh wow, that's my cousin. Well, that's still cool. And so, I go to school and tell her, hey, we're cousins. And then the next day she comes back and say, we can't really be cousins. I said, what do you mean we can't be cousins? Well, is that relationship, right?
Mm,
Her family didn't want her, even though we're related, because of that messiness of that whole
mm.
thing, right? So, and so I bring that up just to, what you said about the Holy Father, and maybe the messiness isn't really communicated. And so you think that's maybe just to protect them, or did they just truly wanted to? I know you don't know for sure, but I'm just thinking about what you know about this issue, or did they just want to completely forget that part of their past?
I think for them and for most families, the intent was just to completely forget forget their
Mm,
histories. To just live in the present at that time, and to forge new lives for themselves wherever they had landed. I think that was their goal. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. That in so many of our families there are half relatives and step relatives and cousins that we thought were cousins and cousins who are cousins that we didn't know about, and all of those sorts of things. And we know from the scriptures that look at the number of half siblings that occur
mm,
in relationships in the Bible, and look at the sort of difference in language that they use when people are described as the cousin of so and so or the brother of this one. You notice that preface is always in there, the brother of John and sort of things.
yeah,
I guess it goes to show us that people have always formed family, found family, um, with the people who are close to them. Be they biologically related or not. And you know, ultimately, we all have sort of a common. We do have a common kinship to each other through our common fatherhood in God, and so
yeah,
um, how we choose to classify those relationships, has always varied.
yeah. And I saw someone quoting you. Speaking of, we stay on the same line of thought. I saw someone quoting you and said, "Man, everybody in New Orleans is going to be looking to see if they're cousins of the Pope now, right?"
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, and I've already had a lot of people reach out to me, asking whether they were related to the Holy Father or not. And some of them are. There's a large
Wow,
Lamel family in Louisiana, very solid Catholic family, and they are just beside themselves with
wow,
joy because most, if not all of them, are related to the Holy Family, to the Holy Father to varying degrees. And I think they're so excited they may call a special session of their family reunion just to deal with this.
oh my
Um,
gosh, this is so funny! Wow, well, we just never had anything like this. This is really rich. Um, what else did you find interesting in your research that you might share with us?
you know, uh, they, at least in the late 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of the Holy Father's family was rooted in the Seventh Ward of New Orleans, which has always been
Okay,
home to a large community of Black Catholics, and they lived in the area that would now be considered a part of Corpus Christi Parish, but then it was Our Lady of the Sacred Heart Parish, which is actually where his grandparents were married back in 1887. And so, again, in the Mass of Thanksgiving for the new pontiff, that Archbishop Amon celebrated at the cathedral on Friday, he alluded to the fact. He said, our Holy Father has a great grandmother who was baptized right here in 1840. And then since then, I've discovered he had another grandmother who was baptized right there in the cathedral in 1798. So that's going back even further. So we're just thrilled. That's all I can tell you. We're just thrilled that he links to our history, and
Yeah,
again, we're just waiting for the papal visit.
yeah,
It's
man,
been
that's great.
38 years since we had one, since St. John Paul II came to New Orleans in 1987.
Wow,
Yeah,
wow, yeah,
and,
yeah. I mean,
and
think yeah,
one
you're second oldest Catholic diocese. Yeah, you definitely do a visit, and why not? Why not this pope of all popes, right?
absolutely, and just to show you,
So
you know,
his
how Catholic New Orleans is, even our NFL team is the Saints.
the saints.
Their emblem is the fleur de lis, which is both a
Yes,
symbol of French heritage, but we also know that in heraldry and in Christian heraldry, the fleur de lis is also a symbol of Our Lady. So the signs are everywhere.
yeah, yeah. I remember the first time I visited there. I tried to get my wife, hey, we should move here, And then she said, well, you notice all these houses are on stilts, right? You know, so I guess she didn't want to deal with, the outcome of some things. But yeah, since the Holy Father's brother, I don't know if this is the truth for the Holy Father, but at least his brother had mentioned in one article, in one interview, he said, yeah, we never really identified as black for the aforementioned reasons that you stated, that you so well articulated reason why that would be. How do you feel about people though saying that he is the black pope? What's your thoughts there, Jari?
You know, I think that I think that blackness is very much a lived experience.
Hmm.
Um, just as any culture, any ethnic background, um, to me is really about a lived experience. I mean, it's the same as if
Yeah,
you or I were biologically or genealogically, if you want to put it that way, say say Irish, Irish American, but for whatever reason, we weren't brought up in an Irish American household. Maybe we were brought in a household that was entirely devoid of any sort of ethnic, you know, celebrations, peculiarities, whatever. Well, are we really Irish? I don't, that's sort of a question, and I put blackness in that same category. They didn't live a black experience. Um,
yeah,
the black experience. They certainly did. As we go into history, and not even in very recent history. But I will put it this way: the Holy Father didn't know uh, his maternal grandparents. They died anywhere from 20 to 10 years before he was born.
oh, in
So
1965 he was born. Okay, all right.
yeah, and his grandmother died, I believe, in 1945. Grandfather in 1926, both of course, in Chicago. So
Okay,
there wasn't even that transmission of a direct cultural linkage there. But he is certainly of black ancestry. That is a fact. He has ancestors like so many African Americans who were enslaved and some who were free people of color. That is without question. And again, I think a lot of the media, sensationalize things. They're sort of looking for an angle. They're
yeah,
stirring the pot, as we say. I, I don't see this revelation in that light. I see it as, and I think if the Holy Father were to be interviewed or questioned about this, he would say, again, it just shows how connected we are. And, I mentioned to a journalist earlier today, most of us grew up with moms or dads who told us, don't go out there messing with people or talking about people because you never know who's your cousin. Or don't go out there dating, without asking some questions because you never know who's your cousin. And I'm
exactly.
going to turn that around and say, let's love one another and let's be Christian to one another because you never know who's your cousin. That's the way I'd put that.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Thanks, Jari. Let's get to a couple questions, and then I'll thank you for your time that you've been so generous with it. Let's get to a few questions. I'm sure there's some here. This one from Mark. He says, "Hey David, great topic. I'm a white Catholic, most Scottish ancestry, and I'm a bit of a genealogy nut myself. And I discovered my four times great grandmother was a slave. Through my research, I discovered she was owned by Jeremiah Van Rensselaer in upstate New York. The Von Rensselaers freed their slaves in the early part of the 19th century. This was all later confirmed when my mom and sister did their DNA ancestry and found out they had over 1% Senegalese. Senegal, as you know, was the place. So, Jar, what is your thoughts on the whole? I know 23andMe is out of business, but what are your thoughts on the DNA as a tool to do some genealogy work for your family?
Sure. I think it's a powerful tool for
Okay.
us helping to discover who you are. Um, it should be used in tandem with, documentary sources, because the DNA can't precisely say, your grandfather was John Smith or your mother was Mary Thomas or whatever. It's not going to tell you that, but what it will do is give you an ethnic estimate, an ethnicity estimate. Usually, it's a pie graph, a circle graph that shows you what percentages the testing company estimates you share in common with modern day populations. The other thing it gives you is it tells you to what degree you match other people in their database. Right now, the largest commercial DNA database is Ancestry.com. The
Hmm.
second largest is 23andMe, which has not gone out of business just yet, but they are having a lot of uh, corporate problems. And then I think the third
Okay.
largest is MyHeritage, and people tend to go with usually one of those top three, along with Family Tree DNA. But you know, for less than $100, you can take that saliva sample and get a picture of who you are. I think it's incredible, and I encourage everybody to do it.
Hmm. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, that's a strong recommendation. I even never even thought about that. I was surprised to hear you say that because I know, like you said, you spend your time in the archives, so it's good to hear that modern science you think is beneficial to that type of work.
I don't mind telling your listeners in my own family, and because I've always been a proponent of DNA. Any professional genealogist or certified genealogist will tell you that DNA is absolutely a powerful tool in our toolbox. But about 6 years ago, one of my aunts, one of my dad's sisters, took a DNA test, sort of on a whim. She received it as a Christmas gift from some of her children, and never told me. Nephew, I know you're the one who's into all of this. I just did one of those DNA tests, but happily, she popped up in my results. But I noticed something. We didn't share enough centimorgans for her to be a full aunt. And I said, huh, something's right here. And lo and behold, and I'd always observed that my father's folks were not prevalent in my DNA matches, and I always assumed it was because they weren't into that sort of thing, into testing, maybe,
Yeah.
whatever. I went over to my aunt's house and I said, Auntie, let's pull up your result, and boom, there were all of my grandfather's people. Long story short, the grandfather I knew, grandfather who reared my dad, my late father, was not his father. And so only
Wow.
maybe 5 or 6 months ago, so this is again 6 years later, did I get a close enough DNA match to confirm the identity of my dad's actual father. And even with that, there was a bit of a mismatched surname. So you got three surname changes within like 2 or 3 generations. So it is messy, as you said. It's messy, but um, it observing the lives of our ancestors, observing the directions that life took them in, I think is a sort of free school for all of us. And the fact that we're here,
Yeah.
it just confirms for me that God is in the mix.
Yeah. 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 Who did you think who's your if you were to put money on who was going to be elected pope, who would you would have said, Jari?
I'll start by telling you who my pick was. My draft
Uh-huh.
pick was Cardinal Sarah, Cardinal
Yeah.
Robert Sarah. But I was honestly expecting Cardinal Tagle from the
Okay.
Philippines, or Paroline, maybe um, um, uh, Pizza Bala. These were the names that were being thrown around by all of the statisticians, the people who tend to track these things, and I think we
Yeah.
were all sort of blindsided by Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo,
Yeah.
uh, and pleasantly surprised. I think that we sense from him a person who is much more in the vein of the popes uh, who preceded him a little bit earlier in the or in the 20th century, 19th century.
Yeah.
His choice of a name was very interesting, going back to one of the longest reigns, that of Leo the 13th. And I think we're anticipating, God willing, a long reign from Pope Leo the 14th. He's only 69.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I definitely hope so. I really thought, not because I wanted it, but just a lot of cardinals go in as pope, right? They
Mhm.
they go in like, oh, and a lot of wind behind them. And so I really thought Cardinal Turkson from Ghana was going to be, and of course, like you, and a lot of more traditional minded Catholics, we were definitely rooting for Cardinal Sarah. But yeah, and when they said Robert, when I first heard Robert come across, I was watching on the YouTube, and I was like, oh wow, I was getting excited. I
Yeah.
thought this was gonna be
And
and
then
then
when we heard
Primo,
that
Primo's.
when we heard that middle name Franciscum,
Yeah.
I was thrown. I said, Robert Francis. Where is there a Robert Francis?
Yeah, what is this?
And yeah, just in a matter of what, milliseconds, when the announcement was being made.
Yeah, awesome. Jerry, thanks so much for coming back on. It's been a while since we talked online, so really thank you, and I really again, congratulations on whenever someone like you just does the work and has their nose to the grind, as they say, and then it gets noticed around the world. I just think that's a really dope and cool thing, and I'm glad you had the opportunity, and I hope people allow you to go back to what you do soon. But really appreciate you. Thanks for being there for us, and I'm so glad that you're a Catholic and you've always been active in the more traditional minded Black Catholic community, and just really appreciate everything you've been doing, brother, and just thank you for being you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for this platform. And I remember years ago when sort of first started your broadcast, and you created an outlet, for those of us who happen to be Black, Catholic, and more traditional leaning, and it was so
Yeah,
refreshing. It was so refreshing to hear
yeah,
your voice. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you, brother. And I'll talk to you soon. God bless.
All right. Take care. God bless.